Patricia Foster is the author of 2 books of nonfiction, the editor of 3 anthologies of nonfiction prose, and most recently, the author of Girl from Soldier Creek, a novel about 2 sisters and their complex relationship with the South, family, and each other. Just Beneath My Skin, her most recent nonfiction work, is a collection of essays that explores autobiography as a means of creative self-examination. Kirkus Review called it perceptive, thoughtful, and thought-provoking, with abundant moments of insight. And the American Library Association noted that although writers can feel alone and alienated, Foster seems to have found a place of redemption, where she is at home living beyond the ordinary, which, in turn, infuses her writing with its notable lyricism. 4 essays in this collection were named Notable and Best American Essays. And in addition to personal essays, she is a writer of fiction and a graduate of the Iowa Writers' Workshop. She has published more than 50 essays and stories in publications including Plowshares, The Sun, Virginia Quarterly Review, and the Iowa Review, and received, among many honors, the Penn Gerard Award and the Mary Roberts Reinhardt Award in Nonfiction. She is the 2017 recipient of the Clarence Cason Award, which honors writers who have made a critical contribution to the journalism and literature of the South. Currently, she teaches in the English department and in the nonfiction writing program at the University of Iowa. Please join me in welcoming Patricia Foster.
Thank you very much. I'm going to move this a little bit over here just so I can have my coat. I think that really, when somebody gives you a list of things, you always think, and that's why she's tired. So what you have is a tired person in front of you with some notes that I hope will be useful. And we'll see about that. Let me move some of this over here. I want to tell you that it's lovely to be in Texas. I don't think I've ever been in Texas before. Not for even, so yeah, boots though. Not the boots. Bonnie said you would appreciate, so I wanted to let you know. But they're from Iowa, and just so that you know the sort of ethos I'm coming from. I always say the joke that I learned when I first came to Iowa is this is what they say about Midwesterners. A man loved his wife so much he almost told her. So just so you know, there's a sense of stoicism. There's a sense that nobody's going to gab. I always say that I call somebody, I'm originally from Alabama, and I'll call somebody from Alabama and I'll simply say, I'm just really looking for some information about X. And they'll start telling me about their prom dress, and they'll start telling me about their neighbor and how you can't really tell if that neighbor has a dragon tattoo on their butt, but they believe it's fine. And I'll be like, okay. I said it's a freedom of information of the private, of privacy that you get here. So it's always very interesting for me to come back to the South, where everybody says hi. Right? Hi. So it's very good. I like that. And I think that I'm going to talk a little bit about writing before I sort of do a lecture, which is not a lecture, but so be it. I think that part of writing is also to destroy the myths of writing. So I wanted to destroy some of those right now. Please don't write this down. One of the myths of writing will also be place and where you're from. And when I first heard about Iowa, I was living in Los Angeles. I had finished an MFA in art, and I took this class with a man named Tom Filer. And I found out, he came into class, he was so elegant looking. He had gray hair, that sort of streaked gray hair, and he was eloquent. He could talk about literature just in every possible way. I was a student who sat with my hands under my thighs, because I'd never written a thing yet. And he told us that he had taught at Iowa, and I thought, oh, he's probably wealthy, and he's probably famous, and he's probably, I just had this sort of elevated sense of him, right? And so the next semester he taught us, he said he invited some students to come to his house to teach the class. Well, that was a revelation, because I went to his house, and he lived on the one dirt road in Los Angeles in a little shack with his dog. And I thought, got it. Really all myths, must be destroyed in some ways. And I have the same feeling about, I have a lot of students that go to Harvard and Yale, and when they first come, or when I first meet them, often I'm slightly intimidated. That little Alabama girl part of me thinks, dirt roads. My first date was in a chicken truck, so that just establishes me right away, right? And then what I realized is, of course, they're very good readers, and they've learned a lot about close reading. But Writing, of course, really doesn't depend on credentials. I know all of you are getting a credential, and so for me to say that seems heretical. But I do think it's important to realize that writing is, in fact, about deep attention, and it's about relentless intent. So it's not, think about James Baldwin, who never got a degree, or Vivian Gornick, who got a BA. So think about that, because writers here, I've read some of your writing, and I think they're very good. The work is excellent, in fact. So I think part of writing is that attitude, is that you have a right to go out into the world and insist to the world that I have something to say, and be willing to express that self, and be willing to get hammered, and still go on. So that is always your task to me as a writer. I want to read 3 quotes that I think are some of my famous quotes, and so to talk about them a little bit. The first quote is from James Baldwin, and I think it's probably true of everyone who is an essayist in some way. He says, one writes out of one thing only, one's own experience. Everything depends on how relentlessly one forces from this experience the last drop, sweet or bitter, it can possibly give. Vivian Gornick says, every work of literature has both a situation and a story. And of course we know from reading a situation and story that she means that every plot has a sense of situation, context, plot, whatever. But it's really the story. It's like what you bring to the wisdom you bring to it, the emotional sensibility that you give to the story. One of my favorite, though, is T.S. Eliot. You can have the experience and miss the meaning. That to me is this sort of wonderful sort of sensibility, because all of us have that. And I was thinking about that while I was sitting in my desk in the motel that I'm staying in, and I was thinking, why do we miss the meaning? Why do we have the experience and miss the meaning? And I thought only of myself, of course, because, as James Baldwin said, one essentially writes from one's own experience. And I thought, one of the things that happens in terms of missing the meaning is that we rely on received wisdom. We rely, in fact, on the wisdom of the culture, the wisdom of the family, and of the therapeutic culture. And we know that to write about the self, and to write even beyond the self, means to tear oneself apart. I know that for me, being a woman in the South, I grew up with the idea that one had to be self-sacrificing, that the virtue was that you put your virtue forward, and partly it meant you had to be self-sacrificing. It also meant you had to go out in the world. You had to do both. But I realized that was, in fact, the received wisdom. That was, in fact, not what you had to do. That's only what you were sort of told by culture to do. I had a sort of revelation of this when one of my students came to Iowa from Alabama, and we don't have a lot of Southern students, so please apply. Let me just tell you, please apply. You good writers, please apply. But this student, I asked her after she'd finished 3 years, I said, so what did you learn here by coming from, a small town, a conservative town, in many ways, a town that that she was utterly familiar with the mores. And I expected her to tell me about the political climate, to say what was it like to live in a very liberal small town. I expected her to say something about the craft of writing. But she didn't. She looked at me and she said, I learned to be selfish. And I thought, well, what an interesting thing to say. Because to be a writer, unfortunately, one has to be selfish. One has to take oneself seriously. Obviously, that doesn't mean you don't have to be generous. You don't have to take care of your kids. You don't have to take care of relationships. But it means that you eliminate the small things, and you make a point of saying that what I have to say matters. And so you become selfish about that time. And so I thought that was a really interesting thing. But I thought of something else in terms of just my own experience. And that's, to me, that and also from reading a lot of work from a lot of people. And I think that the expected wisdom is that if you get ruptured, and everybody's broken, but if there's rupture, it must be fixed. Because that's what our culture tells us again and again. You're inadequate, fix it. I think writers take a very different slant on that. I think writers, in fact, use the broken part, and they don't try to gain wholeness, because that's not possible. Not really. We all know that. We know it in our deeper selves. It's not possible for wholeness. But what you learn is you will learn to examine the parts. You learn to examine the rupture. You learn to examine and know differently those parts of the self that have perhaps been broken in some way. But you don't necessarily try to mend them. Because writing is about claiming everything. And sometimes, most particularly, the broken parts. I wanted to say a few things. I gave you a sense of this handout, the world of the essay, the world of nonfiction, and I want to just go over it just very, very briefly, and then we'll talk about a few other things before we talk about openings. I think the thing is about the world of the essay is that it's capacious. It's a capacious genre. It's large. It's not just one thing. I mean, we talk about writing personal essays, but it's only one part of the genre, right? I mean, and that's the reason I wanted to give you this sort of list. It seems to me there's both memory and retrospection, obviously. There's revelation and self-implication. There's investigation in history. Look at all the wonderful essays that have been done about the investigation of history. Looking back on the Spanish Civil War, Democracy and Deference, Salvador, A Short History of Silence, Dispatches. There's portraiture and personality. There's the quest or voyage. There's speculation and imagination. There's place. And obviously many more. Those are just ones that I wanted to write down at the get-go. Because I think one of the first things in terms of looking at an essay is to say, in what part of nonfiction does it exist? So that you're looking at it slightly differently with a lens of where it's placed in the spectrum of nonfiction. When Bonnie asked me to come, I thought about several things besides beginnings, which we'll talk about in a minute. But I realized that there's certain advice in some ways that I would give to people, and things that I've learned in terms of working in nonfiction. And that's the first thing I would tell people is to do the unexpected. There's a kind of sense of only examining one's brokenness. And that's something that I certainly encourage people to do. But I also encourage people to go way beyond that as well. And to do the unexpected in the sense of, particularly in terms of research. My sense is that we're told to write at slant, but we also should know to research at slant. And by that, let me tell you some examples. Because some of you are going to be doing research. You're going to realize that the stories you have to tell are going to be deepened by the research. And it's one of the things I was telling Bonnie at lunch is that there was a colleague of mine who did this wonderful essay for the New York Times. And it was about the people who fell through the cracks of Obamacare in Kansas City, in fact. And these are people that, for whatever reason, Kansas rejected Medicaid. And these are people who didn't make enough money. I mean, they made just a little bit too much money to qualify for Obamacare, but they didn't make enough to get other insurance. And she wasn't critiquing Obamacare. She was critiquing, in fact, the fact that Kansas didn't accept the Medicaid and what happened to these people. But I asked her, okay, so here's this woman from Iowa. She has bleached blonde hair, right? She's originally from Latvia. She's going into communities she knows no one, not one person. So how is she going to go and talk to people for this article for the New York Times and get them to talk to her? How's she even going to find people? So I asked her, I said, so what did you do? Well, she did library research, obviously. She was prepared to go in. She knew the situation, the political situation. So what she did is she went around and she was going into a lot of housing projects. She rode with the garbage men for 3 days. She rode around with them all around these neighborhoods with the garbage men. Because what did she learn from that? She learned the fact that first of all, people gossip when you're on a truck with them, right? For half the day. She learned where people live. She learned sort of a sense of the ethos of the place, because you start to get that, even the things people are throwing away. But she learned that sort of sense of a place by simply doing the unexpected. Then she began to interview people. Another example is when I decided I wanted to write an essay about women in Alabama, but that sounds utterly vague, and my idea was utterly vague. I had no idea what I was doing. But what I decided to do, I thought, well, one way to get into something is I decided to have my hair done all over Alabama. Because really, I mean, it's kind of a hoot, right? I was using myself as an experiment. Like, why not use myself? I have bad hair. So they could really torture it. And it was hilarious. The first place I went in was in this little mountain town in northern Alabama. It's a little cubbyhole place. The woman had a wooden leg, and she told me, and I thought, okay, got that, good detail. She told me all about like going after World War II. And, stories about that. She did my hair in this horrible style. It looked so bad, people said they wouldn't go out with me because it was these little wave things. And so I got this whole, story of this woman in this little town. I went to this other place. And, I tried to go to different sort of almost like socioeconomic places. And so in the other place, a woman was very funny. She was, and in fact, she was, I used some of what she said in a sort of later essay, which was, she did my hair in these little corkscrews, and it was very funny, but I said, well, it's real humid here, and I'm going to have to spray it. And she looked at me, she said, honey, I got some stuff to stop a fly in mid-flight. And I thought, that is such a wonderful line. How could you miss that line? I got stuff to stop a fly in mid-flight. So I was like, I always got these funny little comments from people. And I learned a lot about hair. So there you go. It's worth doing. So I think research at SLAM. I think the second thing I learned in terms of researching, and in some ways I am talking about researching here, is I learned to be moved by experience. I think that I'm a sort of timid person to go into anyone's life, but I went to Tuskegee, Alabama, which is about 96% black, and I went into this town knowing no one. I went into the school system and I interviewed girls, and the girls would take me home to meet their mothers, and so I'd interview their mothers and just sit at their kitchen table. But one girl actually was had a wonderful voice. I went to her voice lesson with her, and she was a pretty little girl, and but I still sort of didn't know what I had to say about these girls in some way. I couldn't quite put the pieces together. And then this young woman asked me the next summer if I would come, because I'd gone down again to talk to girls, if I would come to her. She was doing a play. She was in a play. So imagine this little tiny town, under 5,000, with a community theater. I mean, I can tell you how much I dreaded it. My contacts hurt. I was tired. I thought it's going to be, it's going to be community theater. It's going to be terrible. But I thought, I believe in her, so I will go. I will go and see what happens. I went that night, and they were doing. It was in like room about like this, with bleachers around the side. There were like 10 people there. Nothing can be worse for a drama than 10 people showing up. We all know that, right? It's really hard. So I thought, this is looking even worse. I wonder if I can leave at intermission. And they did Pearly, which is a Broadway play. And it was fantastic. It was so good, I couldn't sleep that night. And they did this wonderful play. Even though the lights went out during one scene, I'm not kidding you. Even though there are 10 people in the audience, even though this is this little hot summer theater. And I thought, that's ambition. That I understand is ambition. When I do sitting at my desk, maybe not so much. That's ambition. But I knew then I had a story to tell, because I'd seen the trajectory of this girl, and I'd seen a community that engaged people and was willing to do their thing, to try to do the best production they could do, despite all the odds. And I was thrilled. And so I was thrilled to do that. So it was a wonderful thing. My third thing is to make sure that you interview people thoroughly. And I say this because I wrote an essay about my sister. Because my sister was one of these kind of, she sort of had it all. She was a little bit older than me, but she was one of these kind of golden girls. The kind, you hate them. But, she was National Merit Scholar. She was in the beauty pageant. She was, she was a very talented musician, always won prizes in music. I hated having to come after her because the teachers always said, oh, you're Jean's sister. And so I wrote an essay about essentially that leveling, that sense of her being a sort of golden girl and me being this spiral. You see that sort of, that like runty girl that's trying to catch up, right? That was me. So I wrote this essay, and I sent it to her, and she loved it, because why wouldn't she? I mean, she got to be a golden girl, right? Mm-hmm. Until a year later. So a year later, she calls, she's at my house, and she's from Alabama, and she's a doctor. And so she read it one night, and I got up the next morning, and she was holding the book up like this, and she said, "This is shit." And I went, "Well, hello to you too, you know." I said, "Well, what do you mean? You liked it. You even approved it." She called it our essay, which my writer thinks is really like our essay. You could have done it without me. So I said to her, well, and I couldn't figure out why she hated it suddenly. I mean, my God, she had a spotlight. I was the runt. But I figured out what it was. After she left, of course, and after we, snarled at each other, I realized that what had happened is what I had done, not entirely unconsciously, is I'd made her essentially a given. I'd made her the person who just sort of lucked out, who sort of had this benevolence, and was the benefit of of her own exceptionalism in some way. But I gave myself redemption. That's what I did. I didn't even notice this, but that's what I did. I made myself catch up to her. Don't worry, right? That's why she was pissed. So I said to her, "Oh, but nothing ever bad ever happened to you." And then she said, "Oh, yes, it did." I said, "Well, why don't you tell me about that?" So then she started telling me. And here's this girl that says, she's gotten everything. She's never had anything bad happen to her. She started telling me about her life, about particularly her academic life, and she'd always done really well. She's one of those people that reads 3 books at a time. You know those people? And it's always and has bundles of energy, doesn't have to sleep much. And then she started telling me about the things that happened to her, which would have put me under the desk, truly. And so I said, "I'm going to write that essay." She said, "Fine, it's fine, I've had my time." So I did. I wrote that essay. And I called it The Orig, because that's what we called her. She was like the original, the only one, the original, right? So I called her The Orig, and I wrote that essay, and I thought I did a pretty good job of making her have a hard time, fail. I let her fail, right, in the essay. So she read it, and I called her. I said, "So, what do you think?" She said, "I'm going to write my own damn essay." And I thought, yeah. And so I thought it was really interesting, because what you know about a person is also what your lens is looking at. My lens of looking her as the sort of exceptional girl. My lens of looking her as a person with some kind of problems. But of course, neither one was totally accurate, and she never wrote her essay, trust me. But the fourth thing that I always tell myself, and I really do think everyone should know that, is I really do believe it. I think you have to believe, if you're a writer, that you can change the world. I do believe that. You have to believe that. And I say that because books have changed me. Books have always changed me. I think that Huck Finn helped me understand the importance of personal morality as much more important than cultural expectation, because he helps Jim escape, right? And he thinks he's not supposed to. I think that Virginia Woolf, when she wrote Lily Briscoe, she helped me see that sometimes a woman must choose autonomy over relationships. Philip Gorovich helped me see that the Rwandan genocide wasn't just a crime of state, but a collectivized massacre, and that people willingly helped. So writers do help you change the world, because they help you change your perception of what any kind of received wisdom is. You're always taking the hard story, and you're showing the reader the way through. Otherwise, why be a writer? If you're not going to pick the hard thing, the thing that's very hard to do, the thing you don't quite understand, the thing that is a mystery, then in fact confounds you, and try to untangle it, right? I mean, that's what you do. That's the reason when somebody says, "Oh, writing's kind of hard," it's like, yeah, because you're trying to remake the world using the lens of whatever your subject is. And if you're not trying to remake the world, then you try it on the next piece. That's all I can say. You always are trying it on some way. And of course you're going to do some pieces that are less. That's just inevitable. But I think that it's really important to believe at least some of those things. In the packet that I gave you, in thinking about openings, I gave you three different. Oh, let's see if I brought my things. 3 different pieces, and I thought we would look at that. I mean, after all, you're a class. I'm going to make you do some work, right? Boo, boo, boo. Right. All right. I mean, why are openings? I say this because why are openings important? I mean, to think about it. I'm teaching a class now, and I called it On the Ropes. And it's for people, and a lot of times you come into a workshop, and it's supposed to be about, it's actually a seminar, it's not a workshop, but you think you're supposed to bring work that's working. But I intentionally said, this is going to be a class about a mess, about a piece that, for whatever reason you love, that you've gotten your little sticky fingers in it, but you can't make it work. So what do you do with a mess? So one of the things we've been looking at is we looked at beginnings. And it's amazing how much the mess happens in the beginning, where it's not working, where it hasn't been clear what the quest is, what the questions are, what the intention is, what the persona is, what sort of images sort of highlight that persona, and present a sort of a diagnostic in a way. Because I think good openings sort of function as a diagnostic. You have to know what world of nonfiction you're in. You have to know who's telling the story. Not just what persona, what voice. I mean, is it an elegant voice? Is it a reasonable voice? Is it a swaggering voice? Is it a questioning voice? You also have to know how it's being set up imagistically. In other words, what atmosphere or mood is being created and evoked. Are we being told things directly? Are we being told things through detailed images? Are we being told things through a conceit? So that we see through the conceit something that's being told. How many of you have read Down and Out in Paris and London? Raise your hands. Bonnie, good. Bonnie and I'll talk. Well, that's by George Orwell, and so put that down, write that down. You got books, write down Down and Out in Paris and London. Everybody should read that book. Everybody should read that book. And particularly, it's an insightful book for all kinds of reasons. In terms of opening, it's a reason it's interesting, is that what Orwell does is he uses that first paragraph. Down and Out in Paris and London is about poverty. It's about Orwell's first sort of exploration in some way of poverty, which became a real subject for him. And failure, which is a great subject for anybody. Failure is pretty much all we got, right? It's different the way we see it. So in Down and Out in Paris and London, the very first page, I should have brought it, but the first page, what he does is he starts with the room. He's in a room that's filled with bugs. The bugs run around the ceiling. And every time that they get too many, people light a sort of sulfur lamp thing that makes the bugs go into the next apartment, the next room. So people are always having the bugs coming back and forth. But he starts with the room, and he moves from the room to, in fact, the boarding house itself, from the boarding house to the street, and from the street to the neighborhood, all in 2 pages. So what he does is he sets you in a situation and evokes both a sort of emotional and an attitude about place. It's not negative. Those bugs are fine with him. He's there, and there's a sense of joy in Paris. There's a sense of people in the streets and things happening and crazy people around. So you get this sort of wonderful thing from just that opening. Like you're pulled in because he gives you the details. He sets you so that you're moving sequentially down. I thought we'd look, if you'll turn in your packet, to Sliver of Sky. Has anybody read this by Barry Lopez? Okay, so most of you have read it. So think about this opening. It's from Harper's. And let's talk about this opening. And I want to know what you think, what it tells you in terms of the persona, in terms of the details, in terms of why set it up this way. One day in fall of 1938, a man named Harry Shearer entered the operating room of a Toronto hospital and began an appendectomy procedure on a prepubescent boy. He was not a trained surgeon. He nearly botched the operation, and the boy's parents reacted angrily. Suspicions about Shearer's medical credentials had already surfaced among operating room nurses, and the hospital, aware of other complaints related to Shearer's groin area operations on young boys, opened a formal investigation. By the time the hospital board determined that both his medical degree from a European university And his European letters of reference were fraudulent. Harry Shearer had departed for the United States. A few years later, a police officer in Denver caught Shearer raping a boy in the front seat of his automobile. Shearer spent a year in prison and then slipped out of Colorado. In the late 1940s, he surfaced in North Hollywood, California, as the director of a sanitarium, where he supervised the treatment of people with addictions, primarily alcoholics. In the summer of 1952, at the age of 7, I was introduced to him when I visited the sanitarium with my mother. At the time, I lived with her and my younger brother in nearby Reseda, a town in the San Fernando Valley. My parents had recently divorced, and my father had moved across the country to Florida. To support the three of us, my mother had taken a day job teaching home economics as a junior high school in the city of San Fernando, and also a job teaching dressmaking 2 evenings a week at Pierce Junior College in Woodland Hills on the far western edge of the valley. Now, that seems like a very plain opening. I want somebody to unpack it. Why do we need this information, and why do we get it here? And what exactly information are you getting? Why introduce it? Yeah.
Well, it establishes a history of significance with the antagonist, I guess, and how it relates to the protagonist, even though like his part doesn't come till the second or third paragraph. Right.
So we're getting introduced to the protagonist and the antagonist, absolutely, right there. And that's terribly important for the rest of the essay, because the essay is going to be about him essentially trying to understand abuse himself. Yeah.
I think it's trying to get the reader to trust the narrator.
Okay. How's he doing that?
Well, to include all these historical details, this speaker is building up an intrinsic ethos this way. Lots of facts, a very level sort of voice, not impassioned at this point.
Not impassioned?
And so I would assume later in the narrative, when things do become impassioned, or when we are looking at a child, and the memories of childhood where there was trauma, we already have this idea of this narrator that we trust.
We have a narrator we trust, and we have a man who's duplicitous, right? Those are two important things: trust and duplicity. Right away in the first page, you already know that trust and duplicity are going to be, in fact, the conceits of the piece, right? Because he set that up. And as Ruby is saying, there's a sense of almost the investigative reporter at the beginning, right? I mean, we're getting dates, we're getting places. We go from Toronto to Denver to Hollywood, California. We're getting the dates that the man. What about the verbs? What do you get in the verbs? There are not a lot of them, but there are a few that are interesting. Look at the second paragraph. He slipped out of Colorado. In the late 1940s, he surfaced in North Hollywood, California. There's something he's presenting in the verbs even of the escape artist, right? This is a man who reinvents himself. We're getting that. We're getting a reinvention. And then I was introduced, which seems important, because then here we have the conflation, right, of the narrator, of this duplicitous man, this escape artist, and the narrator. So there we have the intersection of the two. So that the first paragraph sets up the sense of the man's perversions, right, in almost a forensic way, just as you said, a forensic kind of way. Always immediately telling us to young boys, groin area. But we get the duplicity. The second paragraph, as you said, it starts to show us the case of the escape artist and the introduction, the intersection of the two. Why move to the third paragraph? What do you think the third paragraph does? Yeah.
Can I go?
You go.
I'm just being a student. The vulnerability of isolation of the narrator, of the persona, far moved. The father's gone, the mother's working, so he's isolated, and that sets up a vulnerability there.
Right. I mean, there's a kind of vulnerability. There's two things, it seems to me. One's a vulnerability and one's a settledness, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a sense that he's telling about this man who skips from here to here to here, and then he says, my family lives here, my mother does this, she works 2 jobs. my father left us, but there's a sense of their setup, which is contrasted. They're settled in a way. The working mother, the lack of a father, to this man before, in the 2 paragraphs who skipped around, who we know is a hustler, right? We have the difference between the hustler and the mother who works 2 jobs, who has a stability in working 2 jobs. So already we're getting a lot in the first page. We're already getting a lot about this narrator, right? And a lot about the implications of the story, because the implications are going to be about duplicity and reinvention versus investigation in some way. So we get a lot, even though it seems fairly forensic. It's very simple. There's no great metaphors. Didn't need them. When you tell a difficult story, sometimes you have to tell it simply. And I think he does a good job of telling it simply, because the next couple of pages are going to be more about the sort of emotional self, the boy that he was, who is in fact being raped by this man, and how that comes about, right? So he's setting up the sort of ethos of stability and investigation for us to go into the deeper sensibility. So I think one of the things is that I know sometimes I look at my essays and think, oh, this is such a plain opening. But there's nothing wrong with plain openings if they have work to do, right? If they have work to do. If the essay itself is going to be about often a traumatic thing, then sometimes there has to be quiet. There has to be a sort of sense of the narrative poise of a writer simply telling something of the facts and something of the contrast. Look at the difference when you get to the second piece, which is starts out it's from Joan Didion's Blue. It's all in italics. I would read this, but I'm so bad at French, you guys are going to laugh. So I'll just say, and that's the French word. How about that? Because I think it's important. Probably many of you read that, but I don't know if you've looked at what this does, and it does a very different thing, right, than the earlier one. In certain latitudes, there comes a span of time approaching and following the summer solstice, some weeks in all when the twilights turn long and blue. This period of the blue nights does not occur in subtropical California, where I live for much of the time I will be talking about here, and where the end of daylight is fast and lost in the blaze of the dropping sun. But it does occur in New York, where I now live. You notice at first as April ends and May begins, a change in the season. Not exactly a warming. In fact, not at all a warming. Yet suddenly summer seems near, a possibility, even a promise. You pass a window. You walk to Central Park. You find yourself swimming in the color blue. The actual light is blue. And over the course of an hour or so, this blue deepens, becomes more intense. Even as it darkens and fades, approximates finally the blue of the glass on a clear day at Chartres, or that of the radiation thrown off by the fuel rods in the pools of nuclear reactors. The French called this time of day, French people?
Yeah.
Thank you. To the English, it was the gloaming. The very word gloaming reverberates, echoes, the gloaming, the glimmer, the glitter, the glisten, the glamour, carrying in its consonants the images of houses, shuddering, gardens darkening, grass-lined rivers slipping through the shadows. During the blue nights, you think the end of day will never come. As the blue nights draw to a close, and they will, and they do, you experience an actual chill, an apprehension of illness at the moment you first notice. The blue light is going. The days are already shortening. The summer's gone. This book is called Blue Nights because at the time I began it, I found my mind turning increasingly to illness, to the end of promise, the dwindling of the days, the inevitability of the fading, the dying of the brightness. Blue nights are the opposite of the dying of the brightness, but they are also its warning. Now, what a different opening that is, and let's talk about that opening. What is the voice of this opening? How would you describe this narrator, and what is she using to introduce herself? What do you think? Yeah, you.
Well, I guess I feel like the narrator is more a pair of eyes than anything else.
Okay. So that's very good. Yes, she is. And what is she noticing?
The images around the color.
Okay, color. She's noticing color and images. Right. Who else? What about you? Yes, you. What do you notice?
Wasn't really paying attention.
Oh.
I'm a student, so I feel like that makes it okay. You can ask her.
Okay. I'll ask her instead.
Well, I noticed how many times she just mentions the word blue
Okay.
and all of the images that are blue, water,
Okay.
glimmering, glistening,
Okay.
you'll watch just how many times she brings up these blue things, and everything that I saw in my head was through.
Was blue. Okay.
Filter.
So the one thing about this sense of blue nights is she's not telling you at the get-go, I'm going to write this book about illness or my daughter dying, right? She's using the conceit of blue nights. And why choose that? What happens to the blue nights? What is this? How is she contrasting the blue nights? How do the blue nights move, right? Because we're seeing, it's not that they're static. They're in fact progressive. It's an idea the idea is not static. It's an idea that's melodic, but it's also an idea that's going to end, right? So part of what she's showing is the progression of the blue nights. There's a sense of promise. That's the reason it's a conceit. The sense of promise, the sense of hope, the sense of redemption even, almost. There's a sense of lightness. There's love and beauty. So what she's doing is she's intersecting beauty and danger, right? Because the blue nights are going to end. The blue nights are moving. And when they move towards the loss of promise, in fact. They move toward, in fact, the danger of loss, the fact of no redemption, the fact of something ending. And something ending is always, in a way, haunting. Sometimes to be mourned. So that her sense of the conceit helps. Yes?
I just thought it was interesting that it goes from I to you to I.
Say it again.
It goes from like the I
to you.
the
Yes,
person,
it does.
And then back again.
Yes.
Sort of just, again, bringing you back, making you the reader part of it.
Absolutely.
Yourself into it.
So it's inclusive.
Yes.
It's first an I narrating, like you said, that the sight, the seeing, and then it's inclusive, and it goes back to the I. But it's a very different way, right, of sort of giving the reader a moment. And then at the very end, notice, it's very direct. She tells you exactly what she's doing, right? So she allows herself only then. How different it would be if you picked up the book and it said, this is a book called Blue Nights, because at the time I began it, I found my mind. See what I mean? You laugh, right? You laugh. But some writers would do that. I'm going to tell you what this book is about. But the reality is that by setting up the conceit and immersing you in this sort of emotional and imagistic moment of her understanding of the blue nights and her first awareness of them, her passing through them, her noticing them and noticing their waning, that she's giving you an arc, a narrative arc right there. Then you're ready for her to say, that's why I'm calling this Blue Nights. You almost don't need that, in fact. It's one of those things where I can imagine an editor saying, cut that. We get it, right? But for whatever reason, she's done Joan Didion. She knew what she wants. And we sort of know that. But it's just very interesting that giving someone a conceit is a very different way. It's a lyrical way. But I don't think it would have worked with Barry Lopez. I don't. I think that sort of lyrical way of introducing to me to abuse would be very hard won. And I think it might be very difficult. The last one I think I gave you is Devil's Bait by Leslie Jameson, who's everywhere now. God, I can't pick up a magazine without Leslie Jameson being in it. But I like her. So here's another sort of sensibility of beginnings, right? Somebody want to read it? Who likes to read? Oh, thank you. Go.
For Paul, it started with a fishing trip. For Lenny, it was an addict whose knuckles were covered in sores. Dawn found pimples clustered around her swimming goggles. Kendra noticed ingrown hairs. A Patricia was attacked by sandflies on a Gulf Coast beach. Sometimes sickness starts with blisters, or lesions, or itching, or simply a terrible fog settling over the mind, over the world. For me, Morgellons disease starts as a novelty. People said they had a strange ailment, and no one, or hardly anyone, believed them. But there were a lot of them, reportedly 12,000, and their numbers were growing. Their illness manifested in many ways, including fatigue, pain, and formication. A sensation of insects crawling over the skin. But the defining symptom was always the same. Fibers emerging from their bodies. Not just fibers, but fuzz, specks, and crystals. They didn't know what this stuff was, or where it came from, or why it was there. But they knew, and this was what mattered, and the important word, that it was real. The diagnosis originated with a woman named Mary Lee told. In 2001, she took her toddler son to the doctor because he had sores on his lip that wouldn't go away. He was complaining of bugs under his skin. The first doctor didn't know what to tell her, nor the second, nor the third. Eventually, they started telling her something she didn't want to hear. That she might be suffering from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, which causes a parent or caregiver to fabricate, and sometimes induce, illness and independent. Lieto came up with her own diagnosis, and Morgellons was born.
Okay, thank you. That was nice. That was nice. A very good reading. You have a very good voice. What do we know here? I mean, who is the narrator? What do you get in terms of mood, in terms of persona? Why does she start telling this story this way? Why begin this way? Why begin with even it and this sort of listing? There's a lot of listing here, right? You get a lot of symptoms. What does that do? Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, I wasn't going to answer, but it just made me feel kind of itchy myself.
Okay.
Reading about all this stuff kind of makes me a little paranoid feeling.
Okay, good. I think she would probably be very pleased with that answer, in fact. Yeah, what else?
It reminds me of a ghost story or like a poster for like an old horror movie where it's like, it comes from the deep. It comes from the deep.
Okay.
So the opening, it's until she says it's Morgellons disease, I was like, what?
What is it? Right. So she set up a mystery. That's the thing that you're both saying. There's a kind of mystery involved because of all the details. Yeah.
She starts with like a wider scope and then it kind of gets narrower.
Yeah. Right. And that's good too, to do this, right? To come in. Yeah. What else? Somebody had their hand up.
I was just thinking about all three of these. There's this level of like juxtaposition between each one.
Okay.
The first one, this very serious topic, and it's
right.
They're just sort of calm about it. And then the second one with this sort of lofty language, and then by the end it's like, boom, this is what it's about, very strict.
Right.
And then this one kind of a little similar to the first one, a little bit, something that's very serious but kind of calm about it. I think that's what makes it successful, is because this crawling around. It's like what makes it work is that it's opposite of what we'd expect someone to react to.
Right.
Maybe.
Right. So to list, it's like a description of, even starting with, for Paul, it, so that you don't know. So it's that mystery, right? It. And then we get it and it, just like you're saying, we get all these symptoms. We get this sort of summary of symptoms and stuff. What else do you get here? Why introduce yourself? Yeah, Ruby, what do you think?
It reads to me like the narrator might be a doctor.
Okay.
Because of how the narrator's positioned. Well, because of the medical language.
Okay.
But also because of the observational nature. Like, the speaker doesn't seem to be a sufferer of this.
Right.
He has knowledge of different people who have been. It's almost like if you read a case study and the names have been changed, so they've given like first names to these people.
Right. Exactly.
Because they don't want to name their actual names.
Right. So very much, she's in fact not a doctor, but it's very important that you notice that in the sense of contrast. That suddenly there's a contrast between what they have, in that sense almost of the case study of names, and for me, it started as a novelty. That's a really important sentence, right? What is a novelty? That's a contrast. For them, we understand they feel like they're dispossessed from anything of the medical position. For them, it's real, even though they're told that the symptoms might be psychosomatic. For her, so part of it is the negotiation that we're going to understand. It's setting up right away that this is going to be an essay that's negotiating how the narrator sees something that she starts out as a novelty that other people take very seriously, but it's not taken seriously by science. So how's she going to negotiate that landscape? Because she's obviously taken all the details intact, right? She's noticing all the details there. And she's noting their claims. For them, it's real. Anything else you notice about it?
Syntactically, the parenthetical usage.
Okay.
She's promising she's going to carry those through. But
Okay.
what you were just saying is that she's going to keep doing these asides, like this is
Right.
what they say, but parenthetically,
Right.
this is another point.
Right. And even the sort of the origin story. So she gives us the origin story of who names it and why she names it. And that's important only because we're going to understand that this is, like I said, going to be an essay about essentially people who feel dispossessed from the medical frame of reference. That they name it. I mean, how many of you have named a disease yourself? Right? Most of us don't. We don't do that. I do it in my head, quite frankly, all the time. But it's usually not a nice term. So it's interesting that she's using these kind of details. Because what is this essay about? It's about belief systems, right? It's about the way in which belief systems intersect. A belief system that is, in fact, discounted by medical science, a belief system of the observer who's trying to decide what she thinks about these people, and how those two dance all through the essay. That's what you get.
And also about suffering.
And about suffering. About suffering.
Suffering is real. Even
Their suffering is real. Right.
The scientists might not.
Right, because they say it's real. And, because it's about suffering. And it's about, so it'll also be about how she perceives their suffering. Not just how they perceive it, but how she perceives it hearing about it. Well, I think that's all. That's good. I think Bonnie's going to ask me some questions.
Yes, I have questions for you. Wow. Okay.
I have to stand.
So you can sit. I don't know if you prefer to stand. You can. So let's just applaud that. I thought that was great.
On certain questions, I may take the fifth. Just guys.
So we're going to go for another 10 minutes, if that's okay? How
We're staying all night. You did tell them, right, that we're staying all night? They brought their...
I'm really enjoying hearing it.
Patricia.
What?
Patricia.
Are you ordering pizza or mom?
I got this Coke. We all have
Coke.
What?
Okay, so you know what I have a lot of questions, but I'm just going to ask you the ones that I feel like are most pressing. I know that you and I share a certain philosophy about the role of the essay, the kind of essays that we love to write.
Right.
And it's something that I've been talking to my class about in my, when I teach the intro to the essay, I spend a lot of time working on the first part of the semester. We talked about learning how to describe things well, to put the reader through an experience, the discipline, which is a lifelong discipline about how do you learn to putting the reader through an experience. But then the second part of the term, we work on reflection and meditation. Anyway, I was hoping that you could talk about what kinds of essays are most important for you in terms of your writing. How do you view the essay?
A lot of different ways. That's a big question. I think that let me back up from that, if that's okay, and say that how I came to the essay.
Good.
Because I think that sometimes how you come to a discipline or a genre, it doesn't mean that you're abandoning other genres. It simply means that you're sort of locating yourself more expansively. I think for me, I came as a fiction writer. I came from studying the short story, and so I would sort of say my sense of the essay resulted from a sort of crisis of representation, I think is the way I could put it. That I did not know quite how to take myself out of the fiction. So that I was writing stories and manipulating stories that were about me, either directly or subversively. And I think that they were starting to limit me, in a way, in terms of the fiction. And I remember what happened to me is I'd sent a letter to a friend, and this is kind of telling and a little bit embarrassing and demeaning. Let's just not forget that one. That she wrote back and said, "Your letters are more interesting than your fiction." And so I thought, oh my God, she's right. Because in the letters, I took away the filter of the person writing fiction. In other words, there was not a surrogated self. And I was writing directly about experience, but unpacking it in the letter. I was trying to unravel what I saw was problematic, so that I came to the essay very much a novice. I've never had a course in nonfiction. I would love to have your experience, but that wasn't available to me. I'm that old. It's unfortunate but true. I'm just that old. Probably mildew standing here. But I mean, there's a sense that... So that I came from that crisis of representation, realizing that in fact that I could use the narrated self, the sort of persona of myself, a part of myself, to in fact unravel what seemed to me deep psychological knots in ways that I had tried to do in fiction because I came from the South, because I came from a family that very much sort of demanded success, and boy did I fail. I showed them in every possible way. Like I said, I lived in a place where my parents wouldn't even come in the door. It was that bad. So that part of the experience of writing, and I think some of that has never left me in terms of that sense of that essays to me start with a kind of question. Sometimes I don't know where it's going, but it starts with something that's that feels unfinished and sometimes painful, I think. And to me, it's a kind of pulling that thread through so that I understand something very different than what I started out with. If I don't understand something very different from what I started out with, it's useless. That's just stupid exercise. So, and like most of you, have abandoned many of those trials. So I think for me, it comes from that. I think that I first started reading, I read a lot of Virginia Woolf's essays, which do, in some ways, a very different thing. I read a lot of George Orwell's essays, which I loved. I read a lot of Best American Essays because when I started writing essays, there weren't a lot of books. I mean, there were sort of James. I love James Baldwin. He's one of my favorites. In other words, he was one of the ones that sort of taught me that unraveling can be personal and cultural, and that's very important to me. That it has a kind of cultural dimension. That it be situated in a society, that and sometimes a small aspect, small s of that, and at the same time not be sociological. So I think that's probably the way I would answer that.
Yeah, great. I'll ask just two more questions, then maybe we'll take one or two, and that'll be it. You are very productive. You have written so many essays. You have published so many essays. And so for those people who are starting out, and you have a big job, and you're always working, so maybe you could share a little bit, how do you manage to be as productive as you are? You always have something you're working on, something you're writing. Maybe you could talk a little bit about productivity.
Okay.
Does that interest people?
Yes.
You've heard of witless relocation programs? Right? I'm joking, of course. But I think that part of writing life is... my husband and I call ourselves the hermits, and we live in Iowa City, but we never know which restaurants are opening, or sometimes there'll be downtown construction, and we'll go, oh my God, that's just totally changed. There's a big building going up. I never noticed it. So I think there was a point at which writing became for me, and I talk about that in some of the essays. I can't remember which ones exactly. Writing came to me from anger. I mean, I'll just say, just absolutely flat out anger. I always tell my husband, I was the angry one. They always have the angry one in the movie. I said, that was me. I was angry. I think I look very cheerful. Not true. So that part of what's always been the motivation is that I come from a family that has so much ambition. Like I said, there's sort of the Mack truck of ambition. And I always felt like the only thing that I could, in some way, absolve myself and explain myself was through writing. So it became predominant. So it didn't matter to me If there was a party, I don't care that much about going out. So I just work. But that also means that you live a fairly limited life. I mean, I do. I live a fairly limited life. I've also traveled a lot. I mean, in ways that haven't necessarily been productive, but I'm grateful for the experience because I grew up in Podunk, Alabama. So, I went to China to an international writing fellowship that was like 12 international writers and me. I I'd been to China before, and I'd gone in other places, but it was really nice to spend like 3 weeks with a lot of international writers and see how differently they were writing. There was a writer from Egypt who wrote this funny book. I suggest you get it, called Taxi. Well, what he did was it was right after the Egyptian spring, that spring, and he was interviewing all the taxi drivers, and they all have all these philosophical opinions about what happened during that spring. It's actually fiction. He wrote it as fiction, and he told me later that they weren't all taxi drivers. That was just the conceit for him to use. So some of them were waiters, some of them were other things. But they drive all over Cairo, right? And all of them are telling a different story. And some of them are telling very family stories, but they're always related to culture and the sense of change in Egypt. And so it's real interesting to do that. All the people I know work all the time. I live in a city, a town where I think sometimes the most rewarding thing for me is to sometimes I love to go out walking at night. And you go out walking at night on Friday night, and you'll see in the third-story window all these people in front of their computer. They may be looking at porn. What do I know? But I'm going to take the high road, and I'm going to say they're writing.
Because I live in a place. I know that a city of writers. Let me ask one more question. I'm going to ask you one more question, which is, so you have written, and I read a beautiful novel called "Girl from Soldier Creek," and I recommend. It's completely enthralling about two sisters. Patricia was talking about her older sister, and I think that these sisters, to some extent, are modeled on you and your sister, and the predicament of trying to leave the grasp of the small town and trying to leave the role that being in that sisterhood.
The runt. Yeah.
So maybe you could just talk a little bit about what it was like to return to fiction after so many years of writing nonfiction.
Yeah, well, I had always actually written fiction and nonfiction. For about 10 years, I only wrote nonfiction, and then I moved back to telling stories because I've always loved fiction. The novel. I'm trying to think of what galvanized me to finally tell the novel. I think the thing is I did not, as you know, we already know the story of my sister. She could write her own damn essay. And I had sort of plotted out a lot of this novel. Not one thing in the novel happened to me. So I moved away from that sort of crisis of representation where I was using experience that happened to me. But in fact, I was using the psychological modeling of my sister and me in some ways. Though in some ways I gave my sister, the older sister in the novel, a lot of things that happened to me in college, and I gave her an interest in literature, and there's a whole section about modernism in there. My sister didn't know a thing about modernism. She's a doctor. But it allowed me to sort of talk about literature too, because I had this older sister go to college. And what I found compelling was, I think plot is really hard, but I'm totally intrigued by it. I'm totally intrigued by the fact that it's a very different way of negotiating narrative arc than the essay. The essay seems to, in some ways, reverberate with tensions. That the tensions, in fact, there doesn't have to be this thing that happens, but there's sort of tensions that are in conflict with each other, and you're sort of pulling the threads of those tensions. In a novel, or at least in some ways it's a very traditional psychological novel, something's got to happen. I mean, it's got to happen, or nobody's going to turn the page. So I got really interested in making, and it was the hard part for me, is making what happened matter, not for the next 20 pages, but 50 pages past then, in which the reverberation would then occur. And I found that incredibly difficult. But I found myself re-energized in a way, partly because sometimes as a writer of nonfiction, I've sort of written myself out. I'd sort of done all the things that felt terribly needy. I mean, I felt I had to do certain things. I felt haunted by things. And so I did feel haunted by those things. I needed to go beyond the scope of what had happened to me and, give that voice. I'm
going to put the name of the book up because I love this book. There's an excerpt of it up on the ALR website.
Okay.
Girl from Soldier Creek. Really recommend people reading this book.
And I think that one of the things that I think there's a sense of what I wanted to understand in the book was the fact of I felt like there's a difference for the girl in what it means to leave home, to have to leave in a way, and to choose to leave. That there's a difference between that. And I wanted to see what makes that difference. Because I think when I left, I felt this incredible pressure and anger. Anger always comes up. It's always just, like I said, I am a benignly angry person. So I think that I wanted to resolve that, what it feels like to choose to leave home. Because when you choose to leave, it's okay. You've made some sort of peace with where you're from. You're forgiving yourself often more than anything. So that's what I did.
So I don't know how people are for time. Do we have time for a question or two?
Go ahead.
So you're talking about like this anger and we're reading the red chair, and we're quite right. The brain can relearn. You don't have to stay in old fixations. Do you ever fear that you might become sort of maybe? Do you ever feel like an overconfidence after that anger? Like once you've triumphed, like do you have like any sort of way to avoid becoming too sure of yourself, making sure that you're kind of still on track with
right? A very good question, very thoughtful question. I've fortunately or unfortunately never been overwhelmed by a sense of overconfidence. I think that anger, I think rage is something that people use. Look at Virginia Woolf, she sure used it in talking about her father. And at the same time, she loved him dearly. I felt intense rage to my sister at certain times. I also love her dearly. So I think that using the rage is giving it perspective and realizing, it's actually rage is often realizing your own frailties, your own sense of despair, and then seeing why that is. So I'm answering this badly, but I think that I've never been overconfident that somehow I'm superior because I know now, because there's always something else in your life that you don't know. So I've never had to worry about that. But I think it's a good question. I think that some people probably do. You meet them every now and then. I try to avoid them because I really dislike people who are that overconfident. I don't understand overconfident people. I really don't. I never have. I don't understand somebody who just says, I'm good. I got great words. Kidding. But I don't understand that. And so I think sophistication is recognizing your vulnerability and being able to be generous because of that vulnerability. Because you realize, like I said, you may be fine now. Everybody's broken. Everybody gets broken. I was telling Bonnie, my sister, who is a very smart, dear person, and also a Mack truck. She'll run over you if you give her a chance. But she's always had success. I mean, for the most part, she's done well. She's financially secure. She has gorgeous children. They went to Harvard. They all did well, blah, blah, blah. And then she got cancer. And now she's broken. And she's never had to be broken before. And I recognize that in her. And I think, man, I got it at 12. I know what you're going through. I know intuitively what you feel. Because I got it at 12. You just got it late. So I think that, like I said, I think sophistication is recognizing that basically you have essence. Circumstance is always going to change. but you're always going to be vulnerable. And you should be generous within that vulnerability, even as you're being selfish to write. It's a hard dance, right? Because you're doing that. Because you've got to do all of it. And at the same time, you've got to really believe you can change the world. Because who else is going to do it? You read, you change. Not always, but sometimes you do. And you're grateful for that. Because all of us grow up in places that are like prisons because we inherit a mythology. We inherit a mythology that says this is the way to be a good person, this is the way to be a smart person, this is the way to be a thoughtful person regardless, right? We all have that. And so I always tell my students that if you do not change something of the mythology you've been given, something, not everything, the society doesn't progress. Because society progresses because we make change. We change things. We don't follow everything. Like my mother would think that, I remember that when I first got my job at Iowa, she sent me 10 pairs of high heels. I cried. Because really, what did high heels have to do with me teaching in Iowa? Nothing, let me tell you, it's snow. But for her, somehow that meant I was supposed to be a lady. I was supposed to stand up in front of people and have my high heels on and my little pearls and things just would go fine. But I cried at that because I felt so misseen. How could she think that would work? But I know her well enough to know she meant it as an accolade. She meant it as a gift. I think that's you're always sort of negotiating that track.
Should we take one last question, Norman?
My question was more focused on your writing process.
Okay.
Earlier this semester, Professor Eugenides had came and spoken, and he basically detailed his writing process lasting over an 8-year period.
Wow.
From reading like the Red Chair, an excerpt that Professor Friedman had given us, it seemed like your writing is very based in real life experiences. Like when I was reading it, when you were describing the character and the way that she picked the chair out and the way that you completely mapped out her life without knowing anything about her, it seems like that you kind of take your time also and allow real life experiences to mold your writing. Like, do you feel like you focus more on that, or you focus more on the mechanics of making sure you add enough metaphor, making sure you add enough this, that? Like, how do you look at that?
Oh, what a lovely question. I mean, the simple answer is I think that I do both. I don't think that I think that life sort of hits you in the face sometimes, right? I mean, it's like there's certain things that you think, that I gotta write, that I gotta do. You don't know, and it may take you a while to do it. You may have to research it too. But you're going to do it because it hit you in the face. I mean, you felt its blunt edge in a way, right? You felt you feel that sort of razor sharp sense of something. So I think that when I'm writing essays, I can do that. I can focus for, sometimes a year, because sometimes they take a long time. But most of the time, I can write something in 6 months that I'm pleased with in some way, going through many revisions. But it's a kind of focused intent. When you're writing something bigger, a book, and I know that many of you are going to write books because I've read some of your writing, that takes a really different mindset. Right now I'm trying to write a book, and what I realized, because I wrote a draft, and it sucks, and it's on my couch. It's got some really good parts to it, but what I realized is when I had to step back from it, I've got to do some research, which I'm not terribly good at, but I'm going to learn it. I mean, I'm going to, because it needs to be more informed. So that's going to take a reading time. I also begin to read, I realize it needs more, not just library research, which is reading, but also some sort of interviewing and sort of questioning and questing in a way. Right now it feels amorphous to me, so it's hard to answer time because I know it's going to be 2 steps forward and 1 step back, because I think a lot of times writing is that I've written one draft, that was 2 steps forward, now I'm taking that step back, and I'm going to have to look at a lot of things that I hadn't planned to look at that are also going to take me out of my comfort zone. And one of the things that I think I learned is that, and it's addressing your question in terms of how you spend your time. Every time you write a new book, you have to remake everything. You think that you can use all that you learned on the first book in terms of craft and like how to begin it, about narrative arc, but because you start a new project, it always is a remaking of the world. You just start all over. You have to like rethink how this one should go, and you have to learn new things. And so it's just crappy all the way through. See, I'm not saying anything. It's crappy all the way through. It's just, it's like there's just no easy way. It's like you'll be poor. So this is the thing. I think it's like it's good early if you're poor. My husband and I lived in a garage. I think you read part of that essay. We lived in a garage attached to a real estate company. We didn't even have a bathroom. We had a shower. Loved the shower, and it was really great. We had a hot plate, and it was the best thing for me. I just wrote this essay called "My Down and Out" after Orwell's Down and Out in Paris and London. Like, what is it like to live? I wasn't in poverty, but I was like, I certainly had no extras. I had 2 pairs of shorts, 5 tank tops, a pair of tennis shoes, and of course, no heating or air conditioning or anything like that. And we had concrete floors. My mom, the 10 pair of high heels, would call and say, "Did you clean?" And I'd be there with a hose. Yeah, I cleaned, because there's a drain in the middle of the floor. And I'm so grateful for that. Because I grew up with the idea, my mom came from real poverty, so for her, being middle class was very important. So I had to take 2 steps back because I realized that to be an artist, I needed to learn not to need things. Not to need pretty clothes to make me seem presentable. Not to need 10 pairs of high heels to make it nice. Not to need the extra hair stuff because I realized it didn't matter what I need to have a studio. That's what I needed. And that's what that's, after all, everybody needs a room of their own. But you get to decide what that room is, and nobody else has to like it. You can hose down the floors. But it was very important to me to have that experience of actually living close to the bone and at the same time putting work first. I grew up with the idea that I was so inadequate that I had to have all this stuff to show me off, right? I had to have pretty furniture because I looked better in pretty furniture. I thought I had to have pretty clothes because who would pay attention to me if I didn't have pretty clothes? Who would, And so I think that one of the things I had to do was strip that background. Once I stripped that background, I thought, it's just me. Whatever comes out, it really is just me. I certainly wanted to change that, but it was a good lesson, not in humility, but in simplification. I felt very much simplified by my life. And so it was very good.
Well, boy, I know that there's a workshop that you're all going to have. Otherwise, we could just listen to her all night, take a break, and have more questions. It's brilliant. So I feel like this is one of the best events that I've been to at UNT. This was fabulous. Thank you so much. You've given so much to us. Thank you. Extraordinary. So my class, let's meet next door. We're going to have a break, a 10 or 15-minute break, but my class will go next door. Thank you.
And I just wanted to also tell your students, you're good writers. Apply for everything when you've got a piece that you feel is worthy. Don't do it until then. But when you have a piece that's worthy, do not shy away from applying for everything. And be willing to take the rejections. Because they'll come too, because everybody gets them. But do not limit yourself. Do not put yourself on the back burner. When you have that really good piece that you know is worthy, it doesn't mean it's perfect. I tell my students there are only 2 kinds of books. They're really good failed books, and they're failed books. That's all there are. They're really good failed books because all books fail. If somebody wants to look at them with, like rose glasses, they go, "Oh, it didn't work." It's like there's problems here. Look at Faulkner. Everybody can complain about Faulkner. He over-explained everything, right? But they're good failed books. And so that's what you hope to write. You hope to write a really good failed book. And give yourself that permission to do it. Because it's what makes you, right? That you put as much into it of yourself, as much recklessness and clarity, and you offered it to the world. And it'll change somebody. And that's the bonus of being a writer. You'll change maybe one person, but that's okay, because that person will be changed. And they'll write you. Or now they'll just email you. Anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you.